Hello there, and welcome back to the channel. In my latest video, I talked about why the live-action Lilo and Stitch is a bad product. In it, I go into detail on the inherent problems with adapting an animated work into live action. Because inevitably the mindset is that something about the original story needs to be changed or improved upon. After all, if that's not the case, then the only reason you're making the movie is to prey off nostalgia and get some easy money. However, the more I thought about it, the more I found that the concept of a live-action adaptation isn't always bad. In fact, it can sometimes be a really creative way to explore the themes that the original work set out to do. Isn't this what most art is? We've seen countless adaptations of different stories throughout the centuries, and seemingly original concepts were inspired by something, right? Each medium has its strengths and weaknesses, which means you can explore the same concept in vastly different ways. Today, I want to give some constructive criticism and go over how to make a great live-action adaptation. I'll also give my own opinions on how I think they should have approached these live-action remakes as of late. Though, realistically, they'd never get greenlit because these studios want to reach as wide an audience as possible. Though, more on that later. With all that out of the way, let's begin by discussing the main purpose of each entertainment medium. There's a great video by the Goldman that discusses the obstacles any adaptation faces. I highly recommend you check out his video afterwards. However, I'm going to take some of his points to explain the main purpose of each medium. Whenever you're creating a story, it's important to understand what's the best way to showcase that narrative. Each medium has its strengths and weaknesses, each allowing for different avenues to explore different concepts. So, what does each story offer? Goldman goes into why adapting video games or books can be great, so I won't go into those here. Plus, the entire point of this video is focused on animation versus live action. However, the same philosophy applies when figuring out how to adapt a game or novel. So, why should something be animated instead of in live action? Animation is my favorite medium because it allows for endless creativity. Because an art style provides a layer of separation between it and reality, it's much easier to believe these stories can exist. There's so much color and emotion you can evoke because the creator has complete control over all of it. Everything is entirely believable since you just accept that's what this universe looks like. Take Avatar: The Last Airbender for example. All the characters are doing these crazy moves with elements. The fights flow so well because despite how unnatural these fights would normally look, the movement of each character adheres so well to the philosophy of each element. You also get some insanely expressive moments from these characters, features which are entirely unrealistic to an actual person. This is what makes the show so great, because all the heightened colors and emotions evoke a feeling of gravitas to the journey. This is not the case for the live-action adaptations. First off, they have to make all the CGI as realistic as possible so it doesn't look bad, which is already a huge obstacle. But more importantly, removing all the goofy moments from the original to quote-unquote make it grounded diminishes or even completely removes character arcs. Sure, some of the sets and CGI look pretty good, but whenever there's a suit that looks a little too silly or a scene where the green screen looks a little too obvious, I completely lose all sense of immersion. This is also why the Minecraft movie doesn't work. I've already discussed this in previous videos, so I won't harp on this for too long, but in short, the original purpose for Minecraft was to allow the player to have an endless imagination to make whatever they wanted. You can build entire worlds and let your creativity run wild. This is why the game is so great, because we literally get to tell our own stories in this world. By turning this into live action, it completely misses the point of creativity. Trying to be more realistic is probably the furthest you can be from that, because you're confined by the physics of the real world, as well as trying to make things aesthetically pleasing. The characters don't blend well into the backgrounds, many of the designs look ugly, and you have an extremely basic storyline. However, while I think using the excuse to turn an animated story more grounded or realistic completely misunderstands and disrespects animation, I do understand the sentiment in certain scenarios. There's something to be said about how we can connect with particular themes or ideas and how characters can resonate with us more in live action. For example, in the finale for Invincible Season 1, we see that Omni-Man absolutely demolishes Chicago. While I was extremely shocked to see the gore and brutality, Ultimately, I can't say I 100% connected with those deaths because there was a level of separation between me and this obviously separate universe. Whereas the Gorman Massacre and Andor, I sobbed seeing the genocide of these people. We get to see in real time all the frightened faces, all the looks of despair and horror, and the extremely visceral screams as the people try fleeing the Empire. The way Cassian reacts to this hits me so hard because these events happen all the time. Even though this takes place in a galaxy far, far away, the plight of the Gormans has happened to so many people throughout human history and is still happening today. The fact this has happened even once breaks me, and I cannot in a million years imagine this being better handled than animation. This is when live action is a better option than animation, because these themes become so real, the actors' reactions become so intimate, they resonate with you on such a deep level. This is obviously not to say animation can't be deep or can't be powerful, but there will always be some layer of separation between you and the art, which in some cases, like the Gorman Massacre for example, you won't be fully able to connect with because it's more clear these aren't real people. With that, let's go through a few examples to see how some live action adaptations worked, and why others completely failed. The evolution of Snow White is a perfect case study to show how to adapt a story properly, and how not to handle it. Now, I've already made a video reviewing both the 1937 film and the 2025 remake, so I don't want to spend too much time on them. However, something I didn't touch on a lot were some of the flaws of the original. And no, it's not quote-unquote outdated views of women. While I believe the 1937 film is amazing, I think a lot of the character work is pretty weak. With such a simple mode of storytelling, the film focuses more on symbols and thematic messaging rather than deep character exploration. Snow White and the Evil Queen are interesting characters, but we aren't offered much time to explore their psyche outside their obvious traits. And Prince Charming is barely even a character. He's more of a plot device symbolizing Snow White's dreams. This is where an adaptation can really help, especially giving more depth to the romance between the princess and the prince, which is admittedly pretty rushed. However, the problem with the 2025 remake, as with most of these Disney live action movies, is that it fundamentally misunderstands the point of the original and quote-unquote tries to update it for a modern audience. But in doing so, it usually turns these stories, which used to have a lot of depth, into very cookie-cutter films where the message is generic or isn't even clear or blatantly contradicts the original in some cases. With Snow White, they try making it explicitly clear that Snow is the fairest of them all, not from her physical attraction, but because of her inner beauty. However, that was the entire point of the original. By reducing why the prince is important to Snow, they've erased all her drive to be courageous and replaced it with a basic story about physical strength defeating a bully. All the comments Rachel Ziegler made don't help because they imply the 1937 film promotes misogyny when it was actually quite progressive for its time. Meanwhile, Once Upon a Time adapted the film so well that they're my favorite versions of these characters. Up until Andor, this was my favorite show, because it expands on the original concepts in such a nuanced and interesting way. So why does Once Upon a Time work so well, and why am I okay with this being in live action? Well, the point of the show is to see all our favorite fairy tale characters trapped in our reality. In a world without magic, how do these stories bring hope and joy to us? Can magic come to our world when we interact with these tales? That's what Once Upon a Time aims to answer, and what better way to do that than with the fairy tale that started it all, Snow White. In this version, beauty isn't a central theme like in the original. However, there's still a huge focus on Snow White's resolve in times of darkness, which was always her defining trait. This new version of Snow White is more girl power and badass than the 1937 film. Just like the remake, Snow White even rebels against Regina. But the show earned this by developing why Snow would revolt against the Queen, which goes back to her inherent trait of being courageous in difficult times. And what's more is that Once Upon a Time keeps the love between Snow and Charming an important storyline. Here, their relationship is much better handled, probably helped by the fact the actors are actually married. We also see a much deeper relationship between Snow and Regina, with a better expansion on how revenge consumes the Evil Queen's life. All the references to the original aren't just for fan service. They're placed based on an intricate narrative the showrunners designed. Nothing is there for cheap nostalgia or political messaging. It all nicely ties back to the themes of lost magic and how to have faith while living in a cold and untrusting world. How do you convince someone they're the daughter of a literal movie character? How do you tell them they're one of the most powerful beings in the universe, birthed out of true love? This is why the show works so much, and it is glorious. While there can certainly be goofy effects, I can't imagine Once Upon a Time being animated because you'd lose the central questions about faith in our world, which is why these versions of classic fairy tales are much grittier and darker than their animated counterparts. If these newer remakes made changes to serve the live action medium while keeping in line with the original themes and messages, I'd be far more forgiving of them. Look, obviously the changes to the source material are much more apparent in Once Upon a Time because it's essentially one huge crossover, but if you apply the same philosophy as the show did, you can portray some extremely interesting dynamics that the original films weren't able to offer. Which brings me to one of the biggest reasons Deadpool became such a success was because he was so widely different from every other hero. Sure, we've seen anti-heroes plenty of times before, but what separates Deadpool is his carefree attitude and constantly breaking the fourth wall. Reading or watching anything with the character is extremely entertaining because you're essentially having as much fun as he is through all these lavishly gory and raunchy sequences. Now, obviously a comic to movie adaptation is much different than animation to live action, but the reason Deadpool's films work so well is because they're in live action. Realism makes the blood and jokes hit more since it adds a level of grime that increases how irreverent Ray Wilson is. There's a visceral reaction you have when seeing him kill people or make incredibly rude comments. Like I stated earlier, this wouldn't work so well in animation because Deadpool wouldn't seem as irreverent. Sure, there still might be a shock factor, but there will always be that level of separation between you and the ultimately not real human. He wouldn't seem as rude because at the end of the day, it isn't an actual person receiving the brunt of a comment or his kills. This is what Lilo and Stitch should have done.
What?
Okay. Let me explain. The original 2002 film works so well because you have all these wacky aliens interacting with the real world. You're fully able to believe this story is happening because it's animated. There's some amazing visuals with the final dogfight and the surfing sequences. So what would be the point bringing this to live action? We've seen that they can make perfectly good looking aliens if the VFX workers are actually able to cook. Though you still have the obstacle of making them seem realistic. But besides that, simply having good VFX doesn't justify the existence of a remake. I'd argue making a rated R Lilo and Stitch would actually be super interesting. Imagine if Stitch acted exactly like Deadpool, causing needless injury, absolutely shredding animals apart, making extremely inappropriate jokes. Like, Stitch saying this would be so funny.
Good morning, my neighbors! Hey, fuck you! Yes! Yes! Fuck you too!
This would keep intact Stitch's nature to be chaotic while exploring new ways for what that means. It could also elevate his arc by showing why Lilo cares for him despite his borderline evil acts. And the stark contrast from Deadpool Stitch to Good Boy would show his progression. One thing I'll give Disney's remake is that it tries exploring the struggles Nani goes through. There is a mental health aspect to her story, and I think expanding on that could be very powerful. However, the problem with this version is that mental health is kind of used more as an excuse for Nani to dip for college. Her relationship with Lilo acts more as an obstacle to Nani's dreams rather than a complicated but loving dynamic. Here's a potential alternative. Let's say the movie starts with Nani's 18th birthday. We see Lilo, Nani, and their two parents celebrate a night out at dinner. The family discuss Nani's acceptance to UCSD to study medicine, and we see how excited she is to go to college. Then, much like that fateful night in Gotham, their parents die in a car crash on the way home. A year later, Nani has had to decline her college acceptance in order to take care of Lilo. We see the toll this takes on her, including extreme depression, outbursts of anger, and somewhat dangerously venting her frustrations through surfing. Having to throw away your entire life because of such a tragic event is essentially the death of your old self, and there might even be levels of suicidality attached to this. However, because of Nani's extreme love for Lilo, she continues to be there for her sister and tries providing some sense of normalcy. Over the course of the film, we see how staying the course and creating a stable Ohana makes Nani happier and more at peace. Falling in love with David, making a career out of professional surfing, and the extra support Pleakley and Jumbo provide would all be factors to healing Nani's trauma. Exploring these deeper angles of mental health will be a great reason to see a live action adaptation, especially as some of these things might be a bit too mature for younger audiences. I know Disney would probably never greenlight this, and obviously they need to market the film to make it obvious it's not for kids, but despite the new changes, the remake doesn't really add anything to the mythos and is solely used as a cash grab, rather than exploring the original message in potentially new and interesting ways. This is the same with How to Train Your Dragon. Now, as of recording this, the movie has not been released, so theoretically it could be a decent adaptation. However, from the looks of it, the movie just looks like it's gonna be a shot-for-shot copy of the animated original. Why? To say their movie remained faithful? If you're not gonna change anything, why make a remake in the first place? There are two scenarios in which I'd be more forgiving of a How to Train Your Dragon remake. One is if the movie was a much closer adaptation to the novel. Now, I didn't know there was a book to this before they announced the remake, and I also didn't know the animated movie isn't an entirely faithful adaptation. I haven't read the book, so I can't say for sure how this is the case. However, it seems like in the books, Hiccup training Toothless is more of a rite of passage rather than a trailblazing event during a war. If the remake was closer to the books than the animated film, I'd be more than okay with a live action adaptation. But let's say the studio is hard pressed to keep the same story. You can still make an interesting remake that isn't a carbon copy. What if throughout the movie we see the humans and dragons commit war crimes against each other? People burning alive, dragon torture, slurs. This would make it so much harder to achieve peace between the two communities. By exploring a grimmer look at this universe, seeing the peace between them would be so uplifting because we've seen all the struggle involved to get there. Again, I don't think the studio would be okay with these films being rated R, and I'm not even necessarily saying they should be rated R either. For example, I think a rom-com from the perspective of David could be a great adaptation of Lilo and Stitch. But I don't just want regurgitated stuff, which at best changes minute details that don't actually add anything to the story, and at worst ruins the reputation and legacy of the original films. Now, before I end the video, I do want to talk about a Disney live action adaptation I actually think really works, and that's Cruella.
Cruella, Cruella de Vil.
I remember when this came out during COVID, and I was admittedly very hesitant to watch it. But given it was an origin story for the infamous villain, I decided it was worth checking out. And to keep it $1.50, I really like this movie. I'm not going to claim this is a huge masterpiece or anything, but you can really tell there was a lot of passion put into this project. Okay, so what makes this different from all the other live action films? Well, obviously it's not a direct adaptation, it's the prequel for a villain. Now, Disney released 2 other films from the villain's POV, Maleficent. However, they still largely focus on the main plot elements from the original Sleeping Beauty. I do still prefer these over slop like the new Lion King. I mean, a lot of the world building is actually pretty cool. However, they're not entirely original plots. Cruella, on the other hand, is a completely new story. The crux of the film focuses on the tension between 2 personalities, Estella and Cruella, the conflict between chaos and order. This is shown through her rise as a fashion designer and her conflict with the Baroness. Cruella makes some really cool clothing that speaks volumes to her crazy side. The flowing dress made of trash, the parachute skirt, the moth dress, and they even took a page out of the Hunger Games and made her the girl on fire. That's Aura. This film works so well in live action because we get to experience the real fashion world of 1970s London. Seeing all the intricate designs and how they're a manifestation of both Cruella and that decade really sucks me into the story. I don't know if this would have worked as well in animation because the detailed textures of every fit is such a core element of who Cruella is and what she's feeling. So much so that I'm not sure it would speak as strongly if animated. I wouldn't have thought her fashion statements were as wacky or cool because I probably would have just said it's part of the art style, and that would remove what makes this movie work so well. All this anger and lust for vengeance from the lies of her past make Cruella such an interesting character. There's a lot more depth and nuance to her than the animated version, and that's because that film never had enough time to delve into her. With the adaptation, we now have a much better understanding of why she's such a chaotic person. I thought Emma Stone did a great job in the role. I mean, every character did a perfect job for what their character was for, but Emma Stone just knocked it out of the park. The way she changes her accent and tone based on what personality she's portraying is actually crazy. I especially loved her monologue at the fountain. There's so many emotions running through her brain, and you can just tell she's fully embracing her insanity. Amazing scene. I also thought the editing and some of the cinematography was great. I love seeing all the newspaper text over montages and some of the other one-shots the film offers. And whoever was the music supervisor, give them a raise, please. The song choices were so good throughout the movie. They were so in line with every scene, and I was dancing and humming along to those tunes. Just awesome. I don't want to give away too much since I think you should check it out for yourself. I highly recommend you watch this movie because I had a blast with it. If more live action adaptations / remakes followed the route of Cruella, I'd be much more positive and supportive of their existence. I'm genuinely interested in seeing more from this version of Cruella de Vil, which is something I never thought I'd say. This is what a live action adaptation should do. Baby, bye, bye, bye. Don't wanna be a fool for you. The reason why live action adaptations of animated projects are usually bad is because they're born from corporate greed to prey off of people's nostalgia. This generally results in a film that tries too hard to be safe or makes changes to quote-unquote fix the original, but ends up damaging the reputation of the brand. If Disney is going to continue making live action remakes, they should at the very least try to add some real creative flavor to them by understanding why something would be better in live action, like Deadpool for example. And I do honestly think there's been a few times the more famous adaptations came close to being good. I think a backstory to explain Mufasa and Scar's separation could have been a super interesting story. But for some reason, they decided to make all the animals photorealistic and making the point of contention a woman? Like, seriously? That is so lame. Now, I recently asked you all which of these four were the worst, and the overwhelming majority voted Mulan. And for good reason, too. They removed all the songs, deleted goated characters like Mushu, and the fight scenes are just...
Ambush! Protect the Emperor!
However, I do think there's a universe where this is a good movie. They at least attempted to change the story to better serve the live action medium, even though the execution was choppy at best. I'd take these badly edited sequences any day over the Lion King remake, which doesn't have a shred of creativity in it. At least turning Mulan into a war drama actually makes sense for live action. And obviously I'd much prefer a story like Cruella or Once Upon a Time because they genuinely add something to the lore. The live action medium suits those stories, and the high fashion or battle grid angles honestly make for really fun projects. Given the enormous success of the Lilo and Stitch remake, I don't see Disney leaving these types of movies behind. My hope is that the artists involved with these projects are able to convince Disney to tackle these stories in a much more meaningful way, instead of using them for a cheap buck. But what are your thoughts on all this? How would you adapt some of these stories into live action? Or is the concept of a live action adaptation inherently a bad idea to begin with? Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.